Well, hello everybody. Happy Saturday morning and welcome to the first session of our second Amicitia Clarinet Extravaganza weekend. My name is Diane Barger and I am professor of clarinet at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And joining me in this endeavor is my Amicitia duo partner and professor of clarinet at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, Dr. Denise Gainey.
Hello.
So we'd also like to thank the wonderful Jessica Harry, who's Director of Operations of the International Clarinet Association, for her help for the Amicitia Clarinet Extravaganza this weekend. She's going to be working behind the screens here, behind the scenes, helping us. So we're so excited to offer this session on the subject of bass clarinet with our wonderful panel of experts. So please make sure to write any questions you may have for our panelists in the chats during this session, and we will do our best to get them answered. So let's first meet our panelists. So Michael Drapkin has played with many celebrated orchestras and maestros, ranging from Leonard Bernstein to to Ozawa. He is best known for his series of books on the bass clarinet that have been the standard worldwide for many years. He has 3 volumes of bass clarinet excerpt books and 2 books of transposed parts, which are sold at bassclarinet.net. He is also currently working on his PhD dissertation called Restructuring Classical Music with Leiden University in the Netherlands. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Our next guest artist is Stefanie Gardner, and Stefanie teaches at Glendale Community College in Arizona and performs with the internationally recognized Paradise Winds, the grant-winning Aegeid Duo, the Arizona Opera, the Phoenix Symphony, Red Rocks Chamber Music Festival, and the 7th Roadrunner Ensemble. Gardner's chamber music albums are recorded on the Soundset label and can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Dr. Gardner is a Silverstein Pro Team performing artist, an Henri Selmer Paris and Conn-Selmer performing artist, and performs on privileged clarinets and Selmer mouthpieces.
And I'm very happy to introduce my dear friend, John Warren. He currently serves as Associate Professor of Clarinet at Kennesaw State University and performs as bass clarinetist with the Atlanta Opera. A graduate of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music and the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, he was previously principal clarinet of the Savannah Symphony, the Omaha Symphony, and the Des Moines Metro Opera. Professor Warren is a Yamaha performing artist and an endorsing artist for Legere Reeds. And the wonderful Sarah Watts is joining us. She's a low clarinet specialist based in the UK. She is Director of Performance at the University of Sheffield and teaches bass clarinet at the Royal Northern College of Music. Sarah has spent her career researching, performing, and promoting the low clarinets and commissioning, premiering, and performing many new works. She is an Henri Selmer Paris artist, a Van Doren artist, and a Silverstein Pro Team artist. Thank you all so much for joining us today. So let's get started with our discussion. All right. We're going to start today with the basics. Get it? Okay. It's too early for that, I think.
It's going to be one of those sessions.
So we want to start by asking each of our panelists how they got started playing bass clarinet and where it took them in their careers. Who'd like to begin?
I'll go.
Great.
So I started playing bass clarinet at the end of high school. Charlie Bay, unfortunately, a blessed memory. He just passed away. He urged me to start playing the bass clarinet. And my other LA teacher, Gary Gray, used to talk about getting to first through bass. The idea that if you play the bass clarinet, it gets you in the orchestra, and then you can move up from there, which is true, because you can think of a lot of examples of people that started out as orchestra bass clarinet players that then moved up in their sections, like Larry Combs, John Ye, a lot of people. So I started out, at the end of high school, and then I never turned back from there.
I went to college and I had never held a bass clarinet in my life. And my second semester at Cincinnati, one of the orchestras had an opening because somebody was going off to student teach. And the conductor, Terry Marai, asked if there were people interested. And I said, yes, of course, I'd be interested. And he said, sign yourself out at bass clarinet and play this for me tomorrow. And he handed me a piece of music. And I looked at it, and it was Prokofiev's Scythian Suite. And I thought, well, wait a minute, this is in bass clef. So I stayed up half the night, learned this music, never knew that all music wasn't in bass clef for bass clarinet for some time, and began doing that. And I played bass at Curtis and kind of had an affinity to it. And just as I was graduating, my teacher from Cincinnati, Tom LeGrand, was leaving his job as bass clarinetist in the symphony and went to Houston to play E flat, which is an interesting career change. And I was in the finals of that audition. I nearly got the job, and that Ron Alfman still plays. And I thought, well, this is great. Bring on the next audition. And there was not another substantive bass audition for 20 years. There had been a lot of churn, and there were no jobs to be had. And I played bass in a number of ensembles, Des Moines Opera, here and there. And like Michael said, I kept getting kicked upstairs to play first clarinet. And so it's very nice to return to bass. I was principal clarinetist in the Savannah Symphony for 17 years until it folded in 2003. And I got to, travel around playing with other orchestras and began playing bass again a lot. And it's just been kind of a lovely thing to return to the instrument that I enjoy so much, and feel like it's a blessing.
Stefanie.
Go now? Okay, so I have a bit of a funny story. I grew up with Beanie Babies. It was all the craze, and I had this huge collection. And I was in middle school, and I saw this huge clarinet in a pawn shop, and I was like, wow, that's such a cool clarinet. I wonder if I could get it to work. So I sold my Beanie Baby collection to buy my very first bass clarinet and my first wooden clarinet. That's how many Beanie Babies I had. I had enough to buy a real wooden clarinet and my LeBlanc Noblet E-flat low bass clarinet. So that's my story. And I played it in high school, a little bit in college. And then after all of my degrees, I formed a Reed Quintet. And that's where I really got my bass clarinet chops. And in the meantime, I've been subbing with a bunch of orchestras, and also playing in a duo with my husband. A lot of fun bass clarinet works. Sarah.
I can't follow that story, Stephanie. It's brilliant. Yeah, I learned clarinet with Victoria Samek in London, and she'd done a concerto by Thea Musgrave, the Autumn Concerto.
Oh,
By that, and so when I got to the Royal Academy of Music, I started taking a bit more interest in the bass clarinet, and I had an absolute dog of a college instrument that would not do anything. But my mum scrimped and saved. She was a single parent family by then, and she got me my first bass clarinet, and I got in contact with Joseph Horrock via a contact in London, and he sent me a big pile of music. And so from that, I just started specialising in solo repertoire. I met Henri Bock when he was in London working with Victoria, and he invited me to study with him in Rotterdam. So I did my master's in Rotterdam, and then just wanted to go back to the UK and set up a solo scene in the UK, because that was still very much developing back in the early 2000s. So that was my route.
That's awesome. So how essential do you all think it is learning to play an auxiliary instrument, and what recommendations might you have for someone wanting to start playing bass clarinet?
I think it's vital. I mean, especially these days, the more skills you have, the better. And be that E flat, basset horn, bass clarinet, the beast, it doesn't matter. It's going to give you an employable skill. And we're not all going to go out and get orchestral jobs these days. It's just not going to happen. So the more you can do and the more you can explore, the better your career is going to be.
Makes you a more flexible B flat player too. A lot of things that you learn on bass, like using more air or voicing or just being more flexible in general with finding pitch, it just makes you a better B flat player too.
In terms of high schoolers or middle schoolers, I feel like everybody should play bass clarinet, literally everybody. And I would also say the corollary to that is nobody should only play bass clarinet. There are very few people who are able to make a go of that. And it's like Stefanie says, it will improve your soprano clarinet playing. It will make you eligible for things that you cannot do alone with B flat. If you only play bass clarinet, that limits you even more. So my maxim is everybody should play and nobody should only play.
Yeah, the only specialist that I knew very well was Dennis Smiley in New York City. And Dennis was the bass clarinet specialist in town. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us.
But of course, even somebody like Dennis, if he played in the Long Island Symphony or something like that, he had to play third in bass. And, Dennis was a good clarinet player as well.
Yes.
Even Harry Spane played clarinet from time to time, and I think it's just essential. And I think anybody who says you can just be a bass clarinetist these days isn't really doing justice to their student.
A lot of good points there. So what are some of the differences players can expect between playing soprano clarinet and bass clarinet, particularly focusing on some pedagogical differences when it comes to embouchure, voicing, and articulation?
You're gonna have to call on us.
I know it's a big question to answer. We
Yes.
understand. So, but yeah, just maybe I think just start with the main differences, because I think voicing obviously is one of the major differences, right? And in fact, we have some questions already in the chat. Best way to explain to a junior high student how to play G5 and above, with student level equipment. With bass clarinet. So I know that's a lot of questions. So Michael, you want to start? There, I picked you.
Yeah, going backwards, the best way to get them to play above the break is to have an instrument that's capable of going above the break. Because most of the time, if you get an instrument from school, it may be in very poor repair. And if you have any leaks or things like that, you're going to have trouble getting up there. So that's usually the first thing that I take a look at. Is the instrument actually working? So I think, everyone's got a different spin on their opinion about the bass clarinet, but for me, the bass clarinet has been the other solo instrument in the clarinet section in the orchestra, and you treat it as such. And when the conductor tells you that you're playing too loud, you're probably at about just the right volume at that point.
You say, thank you very much.
Exactly.
My proudest moment was having George Mester out in Aspen tell me and Dennis Smiley that we were burying the orchestra in Rite of Spring. So thank you. That's very nice of you to say.
Did you put that in your bio?
Yeah.
I should do that.
So Stefanie, can you talk about voicing differences?
So the embouchure in particular needs to be a lot looser. I always think of the syllable foo for the lower lip just to make it a little bit looser. I find that people get too tight when they're going from soprano to bass. Also, they're not taking enough mouthpiece generally, or the neck angle is too much like this and it needs to be closer like a clarinet. So bringing the bell underneath your chair a little bit depending on the neck that they have. One of my favorite tricks to get students to play this G that people are asking about in the chat is to play it on soprano clarinet, an open G, and then they get that pitch in their ear and then they match it and play it on bass clarinet, of course, with the looser embouchure too. Also overblowing 12ths. I like to do that on bass clarinet, just playing open G and then overblowing to a D above there, and then working down by half steps just to get flexible without changing the embouchure or the fingering, just doing throat tone overblowing so we can start to get into that altissimo. Sometimes students can get the altissimo easier and then work their way down into that upper clarion that gives a lot of people problems. Those are just a few of the tricks that I would use. Also playing long tones every day, just like basic warm-ups that you would do on your soprano clarinet. It's a different animal, so play those warm-ups, long tones, scales, arpeggios, so you can actually start leaping and getting the voicing that way. There's no shortcut, unfortunately.
Yeah. And setup as well. And there's a lot of people who will grab the college instrument and the awful mouthpiece that comes with the college instrument, and then have a reed that they've had, the one reed that they'll recycle for a year. And you wouldn't do that on clarinet. So, number one is buy your own mouthpiece, because that will travel from bass clarinet to bass clarinet. And I'm not going to go into which, because we're all so different. So my other rule is, for me, never play what your teacher plays on. I think that was the biggest mistake that my own teacher made. He tried to make everyone play on his setup and make money off it. And I could play on that mouthpiece, but I'm so much happier now. I've made my own decision and my own route. And it's really interesting what my students bring to me. Some of them can play on my setup. Some of them will have completely the opposite setup and get just such an amazing sound. So mouthpiece one, and get a box of reeds. Don't just get one reed. And rotate them. Reeds work, just the same as clarinets. You'll have one reed that will work in one place, one that will work in another. So reeds and mouthpiece for me is essential.
Another interesting point is that I always see the bass clarinet as having like a dual personality. When you're playing in the low range, I mean, you want the floor to vibrate. You want your eyesight to be a little fuzzy, from the resonance of the instrument. But then when you get to the upper register, you have this wonderful plaintive instrument that can play so wonderfully expressively. A few years ago, I did a performance of Death and Transfiguration. I played bass clarinet with my orchestra in Texas. And on the last page, in the Transfiguration part, there's this great lick where you go way up to high E and you're soaring above, high E, an octave above the staff. And, you're soaring above the orchestra, and it's so gratifying and moving to play that on the bass clarinet. And it's not something you usually think about. Usually you think about bass clarinet as playing, bum, 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 but there's just, great stuff out there where you can express yourself in different ways on the instrument. And learning how to exploit that and bring that out in the instrument is like one of the great things that separates you from other people who just, kind of play the instrument.
Before we move on to something else, there's a really good question on Facebook from Katie Morrill. What would be your advice if you encounter a student who is an excellent bass clarinet player and then wants to learn soprano that may not have played extensively in the past? What would your recommendations be for that switch?
I have lots of these students. A lot of my studio come for bass clarinet, and then I'm like, well, you also need to learn to play soprano clarinet. So we do both in lessons. And just like I was saying with learning bass clarinet for the first time, approaching it with long tones, making sure that you do a lot of embouchure work to get the tighter, really particular soprano embouchure. But, just doing the same kinds of warm-ups, scale work, lots of playing with the drone so you can find the intonation right away. I find that's the hardest thing because they all know the fingerings pretty well. Of course, we use different ones for the Altissimo and everything, but finding pitch right away and voicing exercises, just, being in shape on both instruments. You can't have a favorite child, I think. You have to spend time with both every day.
Do you think they struggle with the open tone holes all of a sudden, comparatively?
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of mirror work.
I think it's much harder to go from bass to soprano than the other way around. Take a good soprano player and you hand them a bass clarinet and give them 45 minutes and they can do it. But it takes good bass clarinet players a while to learn what they really need to do to get the most out of soprano clarinet. Many of them don't, even if they're pretty good bass clarinet players, they haven't really played much in the bass clarinet's altissimo register, let alone the clarinet. So it's a whole new set of fingerings. It's just a whole new vibe. They come to it with good air support and lots of oomph, which is great. But it is a challenge right off the bat to get that. I haven't taught a lot of young kids to do that, so I'm not having too much trouble with covering fingers. But it is a challenge. And, Stefanie would tell you, I'm sure, you get plenty of people who you get a call, I'm interested in coming to your university, your school, but I'm a bass clarinet player. Can we do that? Which is an interesting topic for discussion. It's like, well, you want to be a band director. Why can't you come to school and just play the bass clarinet? Well, for one thing, if you're just going to play the bass clarinet, you're going to hog all the bass clarinet parts, and all the other kids that need to play bass clarinet aren't going to get a chance. So it's kind of a tough love, hard sell that, yes, you're going to play soprano clarinet, and you're not going to play bass clarinet in anything for at least a year till we get that going. But I've had good luck, good musicians who were bass clarinetists who 18 months later were playing Copland in a concerto competition. So it certainly can be done.
I think we have a different system in the UK, so it would be very rare to get a youngster coming from bass to soprano. It would nearly always be that you would do soprano and then move on to bass later. So I don't think I've encountered students that have done the other way around.
We have a lot of students in Arizona that do bass clarinet and marching band, and that's all they play. And then it comes time, they're like, oh, I want to be a music ed major, or I want to major in music, and they haven't played any soprano clarinet at all. Yeah. And we have our work cut out for us.
I get those too. I do. So what about, John's kind of mentioned bass clef issue a little bit earlier. Any tips for learning to play in bass clef, since we have to deal with that a lot on bass clarinet?
Well, the standard way that most people learn is you go and pick up a copy of the Bach cello suites, or you can download them in IMSLP now for free, different editions. And, just start learning them as written. They're very tonal. They are all over the instrument, and they give you a great way of learning how to play it. Just a quick anecdote. When I was a freshman at Eastman, they had an opening for extra clarinet. They were having an audition for extra clarinet with the Rochester Philharmonic. There it is. And I decided as a freshman I was going to go do this audition. And of course the upperclassmen said it would be very unusual for a freshman to be competitive. And I actually was the runner-up. But what killed me was that they pulled out the slow movement of Prokofiev Fifth, which is in bass clef. And I hadn't learned how to play bass clef yet. And that kind of, did it for me, because I just sort of stumbled through it. And I mean, they said to me, well, you're going to be here for 4 years. You'll have other opportunities, which of course I did. Bill Helmers and I used to split that book. But after that, I said, okay. And I went and got my copy of the Bach cello suites and started working through them. So lesson learned.
Yeah, I still play the Bach cello suites. There's also this book, Pedro Rubio has written a couple of study books. So there's book one, which is a grey book, and that's great. It's in treble clef, and it really covers the low notes on the bass clarinet. And then this book book two move into bass clef. But what's nice about the early studies is he does them in treble and bass. so that you can double check. And then later in the book, he does some of the German notation of bass, but then it goes into treble clef where you go up the octave. And they're all very nice and classical and very tonal. So I really love that book.
I think just picking out a Bach cello suite movement and putting them side by side, putting a treble version, putting a bass version, and just hear the same notes and look back and forth, and it becomes like, if you double on saxophone, at first you're having to think and translate, and then in time, when you pick up the saxophone, your fingers just know that there's a saxophone there, and you just do it. You take out the thinking part. Bass clef is a challenge, and it's something that a lot of kids won't have to do if they're not playing orchestrally, and it's also something that Michael has made books that let us avoid bass clarinet in A, putting parts that are in bass clef into treble clef. I think with the advent of Sibelius and stuff like that, it's not a rare thing to find a part in treble if you want a part in treble to a Prokofiev Fifth Symphony. They're out there now. Same thing with bass clarinet in A. It's such a chore to learn, especially say a piece like Rachmaninoff, The Bells, bass clef and treble clef, both of them in both A and B flat, and it's really head scratching. But it's like, this is the 21st century. Why do you have to do that? And you really don't, because somebody has done it for you. And I think if you're a serious aspirational orchestral bass clarinet player, that you're never not going to learn those things. But I don't think it has quite the application that it did back in the 20th century.
Well, actually, the transposed parts books that I published, if the part was in bass clef, I left them in bass clef. The only gesture that I did is that if there was parts where you had to do clarinet and C, I did transpose those into B flat, just to make it nice. But people will contact me periodically and say, do you have a treble clef part to fill in the blank, right? I get asked that a lot, and I go, why? Do you not know how to read bass clef? If you don't, you need to go and learn it. That's part of being a bass clarinetist if you want to play in the orchestra. And when you get used to it, it's not a big deal. And the people who have the best example, John.
My boy.
Somebody go mute that guy.
Hey, John.
But
Sorry, I just muted you, John. Love you.
We just got Zoom bombed by John.
I just totally lost my train of thought there. But yeah, you need to learn how to read. You need to know how to read bass clef as a bass clarinet. Oh yeah, and the people who have the big advantage. A lot of people, before they play clarinet, they play piano, so they already know how to read bass clef. Unfortunately, I was not one of those. But as I was saying before, John in particular was bugging me about taking the Bach cello suites and learning how to read those on bass clef. So
I want to add something. If your school doesn't have a bassoon, sometimes the student might have to play bass clef and transpose. So that is definitely a good skill too. When I was playing some quintet stuff at a summer camp, they didn't have a bassoon instructor. So I was playing woodwind quintet repertoire, but playing the bassoon parts on bass clarinet, and that's a really important skill to be able to just cover a bassoon part if you don't have a bassoonist.
My wife is sitting over there. She's a bassoonist in the Atlanta Symphony, and she just said, "Oof."
Sorry, so sorry.
But sometimes they're not to be had,
Right. My school doesn't have very many bassoon students, so it happens more often that bass clarinets cover.
Right.
Yeah, it's quite common over here as well with adult bands as well. There might not be a bassoon, and the bass clarinets will jump in. So, yeah, it's a common one.
to maybe round out our basics portion of this session, could you guys talk about some study materials you would recommend, including repertoire and pedagogical books, or even resources on bass clarinet?
Well, I heard there's some good bass clarinet excerpt books around.
I think that you really should play absolutely anything that you would play on the clarinet on bass. So bass clarinetists play Rose etudes, bass clarinetists play Weber concertino, bass clarinetists, there's no sacred repertoire. I think the whole the thing about basic bass clarinet books, you're better off just playing clarinet stuff. You're challenged more. I think a lot of people don't challenge their bass clarinet players, and their bass clarinetists just don't thrive because they aren't being asked to play above a G, and they aren't being asked to play above high C. So when I'm teaching bass clarinetists, I use pretty much the same stuff that I use to teach B flat clarinet. There's some bass clarinet specific literature that I'll use, but anything you can play on bass, you can play on clarinet, or I should say the other way around. I don't really have a special way of finding rep and building materials, etudes for bass.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I think I agree to a point, but I also disagree slightly as well, because for me, teaching at conservatoire, one thing that motivates my bass students is actually not studies and not orchestral excerpts, but it's actually finding some original rep. And so often at conservatoire, I'll start with the basics of like embouchure first. We will get a Bach cello suite going, but to give a young student something like the Bozza Ballad or the Lied, Dieter Romance, Schuch Sonata. There's so much original good rep. I just find it really motivates them, and from that I'll tend to find out what each student likes, what genre they like. And I've got so much rep in this room that there is something for everybody to play. I have a lot of adult students as well, and they want original rep as well. We've done a little bit of commissioning over in the UK for kind of new rep that's aimed at good players who want to do original rep. So yeah, I do sometimes play arrangements, but for me there's so much good rep that I like to use.
I'm
All right.
probably, sorry.
Go
can I
ahead, no,
add to
Stephanie,
that?
please go
Yeah.
ahead.
So I probably use a mixture of materials. I love the Weizenborn books, and of course, I also, like John, will use Rose etudes or etudes that clarinetists are already familiar with and just play them on bass clarinet. I also just put a rep list in the chat that has a big section on method books, and a lot of Michael's books are in there. But there's a lot of original things, as Sarah was saying, and I think it's important to talk to the student. Do you want to play something that's traditional? Do you want to play something that's for bass clarinet? And you get a wide variety of interests, and I think it's really important that the students invested in whatever they're doing. And then again, they're going to practice more and just, really be into whatever they're working on. Also, bass clarinet choir that Sarah has, I think that's a great opportunity for students to get their feet wet with bass clarinet. Some of my students are super advanced bass clarinetists. Some of them are just playing bass clarinet for the first time. So I have this huge mix, and you just have to be careful what parts you assign where. But that's a wonderful opportunity for everyone to get to know bass clarinet, and it's just a really fun ensemble, as Sarah knows.
Yeah, I think it's making the auxiliary instruments fun. Actually, we had a meeting with colleagues the other day about both E flat and bass, and our conversation turned into what makes a student want to play and want to practice a bass and an E flat. And ultimately, we just said to everyone, well, actually, they have to enjoy it. And so we're now looking at repertoire that we can add to kind of solo lists with that in mind.
That's great. And I just, so everybody who's watching via Facebook, I put Stefanie's link in the Facebook chat, just so you guys know. So
Thanks for doing that. All right, well, let's go into our second big topic that we have here, which is ensemble opportunities for bass clarinetists. And maybe let's start by talking about orchestral playing. And we don't want to maybe not spend too much time talking about specific excerpts, but maybe we can list them in the chat as we go. But what are your, we talk about the top 10 excerpts for bass clarinet in the orchestra? What would you say from those of you who have played them?
Not anything by Richard Strauss.
Shostakovich for me. I think he changed the way bass was used. I think Shostakovich is the bridge point between orchestra and solo for me. It's genius writing. You know, Shost 6, 8, violin concerto, fabulous.
And Gustav Mahler too.
7 as well.
So many. It's so gratifying to play bass in orchestra because you really feel like with every note you play, you're a soloist. You know, if the point isn't to have somebody in the audience hear something that you're playing, they should absolutely feel it. They should feel it in their body. That we have that kind of vibrational possibility. So even if you're not playing a solo, if you're just playing at the bottom of a chord, I mean, there's nothing more fun than wailing away on bass clarinet in a John Williams Pops concert, you know, and just reveling in the low notes. And there's certainly tons of big bass clarinet parts out there, Rite of Spring, Don Quixote, all that. But it doesn't have to be, for me, it doesn't have to be a piece that has an enormous bass clarinet solo to be enormously enjoyable to play. Every piece that has bass, you're the soloist.
It's interesting because the last concert I did before the pandemic was sitting in with the Colorado Springs Philharmonic doing American in Paris, which is a deceptively difficult bass clarinet part. Mm-hmm. And part of what makes it difficult, and this is sort of the challenge with a lot of Gershwin's writing for the bass clarinet, is that he treats you like your third clarinet instead of bass clarinet, right? So he'll write you in unison with the rest of the clarinet section where you're playing way up there, where it's very challenging. So it's one of the things you have to watch out when you play his music. But yeah, there's so many great tunes, like the big solo in Mahler 6 in the first movement, where you're basically the soloist with the entire orchestra. I mean, these are moments that we live for, is when we get to do that and show what the bass clarinet can do, right? What's great about that solo is it's mostly in the upper register too. It isn't down there. Lots of other composers. And yes, Sarah, I agree with you about Shostakovich. Just some amazing bass clarinet writing in there. So you take it where you can, but again, you're the soloist when you're playing in the orchestra, and more likely you're going to end up playing with either the bassoons or cello than you are your own clarinet section, right? So you can kind of ignore the people that are to your left, and go off and do your own thing, which is just very gratifying.
Now, I play second and bass in the Atlanta Opera, and so whenever there's bass, I have the option to play it. And even with works that we've done multiple times, I have never chosen to play second clarinet over any bass part, because you really are your own little section down there. And to me, it's just more gratifying than playing second clarinet almost inevitably.
So outside of orchestral playing, what other opportunities are there for such as like the Reed Quintet for a bass clarinetist, or other ensembles featuring bass clarinet?
I think the question then is, what isn't there these days? There's a combination for everything, I think. Yeah, I've had a piano duo going for, well, since 2003 when I came back to the UK, and that's just been fantastic. There's so much, again, original repertoire written for bass, clarinet, and piano. And we're still adding to it. That's just an amazing combination. And I also do a lot with flute. I play with a group called Rare Scale, and we specialise in low flutes. And you know, there wasn't so much repertoire when we started doing it, but if there's no repertoire for your combination, you commission it. And so yeah, we've got a lot of repertoire now for bass clarinet, bass flute, alto flute, doubling, mixing, contra and contra. So that's a fun combination for me.
Can people contact you regarding, because I think that's the problem, is people can't access this
Yeah,
repertoire.
it's very difficult. Yes, yeah, just contact us, shout on Facebook, and yeah, we can certainly always point you in directions. A lot of people do and ask for suggestions. Um, yeah, I've done a lot. Bass clarinet bassoon, there's repertoire for that. You can add to the wind quintet, Melody, for example.
Mm.
It's endless. There's so much good rep out there. Big heart
Well,
for
yeah.
Melody.
And Stephanie, you can probably talk about the Reed Quintet, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I am very fortunate to play in a Reed Quintet. It's a fairly newer ensemble, of course. They've been around in the Netherlands for 30 or 40 years now, but in the United States, I'm one of the first Reed Quintets in North America, and most of our music is original. We do have some arrangements that our own members do, but as Sarah was saying, a lot of the pieces are commissions and premieres, and they're written for us. The bass clarinet's role is very fun and flexible. Sometimes I'm playing with bassoon and have ruckus, low in, loud rock and roll lines, or I'm playing super high, screechy things, and there's a lot of timbre play where you can't tell, oh, is that a soprano clarinet or is that a bass clarinet? Is that a soprano saxophone or is that a bass clarinet? So it's really great the way composers are writing for the instrument. It's such a flexible thing. You can play as soft as you want, as loud as you want, as wild as you want in the Reed Quintet, and no one's gonna stop you. It's fantastic. I did want to add one thing to the orchestra talk just a minute ago. If you've had the opportunity to play anything by composer Nina Young as a bass clarinetist, that is such a treat. That she writes harmonic glissando, she writes all over the instrument, slap tonguing, crazy, fun bass clarinet parts. So I hope that if you haven't played anything by Nina Young, that you get to.
If I could just add to this, it was actually playing the bass clarinet that got me my first performance in Carnegie Hall. Um, I was asked to play with Charlie Neidig, and so I think it's Sylvan Winds was that his group at the time? And I ended up doing a performance. I think it was was it the Hindemith that has the bass clarinet on it? I can't remember, it's getting fuzzy. But that was the first time I got to play in Carnegie, was because I played the bass clarinet. So if you set aside the whole issue of, yeah, Hindemith septet, thanks, John. So if you set aside the entire issue of how do I earn a living playing, the clarinet, which is a completely different discussion, there's a lot of different vectors that you can follow, whether it's, playing in an orchestra, playing a duo like what Sarah does. You can follow the Michael Lowenstern route. I don't know if you've ever seen any of his performances, which are unbelievable. He does bass clarinet and electronica. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go and express yourself as a musician when you play bass clarinet. So it's really up to your own creativity and what you're interested in. But it's there, like Sarah says.
I wanted to add one thing. I love that John is here, because I will never forget being a much younger clarinet player, being at Clarinet Fest and hearing John give a master class, and he played bass clarinet in the class. And I'd never heard anybody play bass just like it was an instrument. Coming from an undergrad, I had never played it before. But it was also my first entrance into the orchestra when I started playing the Asheville Symphony. That's how I got in, started playing bass. And I loved it. I actually fell in love with bass and still play a lot. But I just remember the first time I heard the bass as a musical instrument, really, and not just having some colleagues play it in Wind Symphony or something. and it was amazing. So thank you, John, for that. Thank you. Gosh, I guess we should go maybe on to our next topic. So the next thing we wanted to discuss, the fun stuff, altissimo fingerings and extended techniques for bass clarinet. Woohoo! So who wants to start talking about that? So maybe when and where to use overblown fingerings and how to work on the altissimo register in general, maybe is a good place to start.
Yeah, I think it's having access to good charts, and actually Stephanie's got high note fingering charts, and I've got some charts as well. Stephanie, you've got yours all to hand. I have to scramble around in my.
I just put mine in the chat there,
Yeah,
and it's
Perfect.
it goes pretty
Thank you.
high, and there's lots of alternate fingerings. I find that if one fingering doesn't work, try another one. There's so many ways to play these high notes, and it's actually a great voicing exercise in itself if you can play high D 3 ways or high G 20 ways, you know. So just keep messing around till you find a fingering that you like. Sarah's chart is great too. Hers is a little, I think, easier to see because it doesn't have all the leisure lines. She'd put it. Mine's like, what note is that? So many lines, but you're welcome to use that resource. It depends on the scale pattern for me, or if I'm leaping, what fingerings I'm going to use. It really just depends on the situation. I don't have a one size fits all approach to this. Does anybody else care to chime in about that?
Well, let me just add really quickly that I have Sarah's chart and Jason Alder's charts available as free downloads on my website at bassclarinet.net. Sarah, I'm sorry.
That's the important thing. Is like they're not my charts, they're everyone's charts, because the only way we find all of the fingerings with bass is to share, and every instrument is slightly different as well. So even with, you know, my students, say in Manchester, I can give them my charts, but then I'll say, right, you'll probably have to add or take away fingerings here and there just to make sure that they're in tune or they work for your instruments. And there can be slight differences between buffet and Selma as well. So actually, the more fingerings you have, the better. And you know, when Harry Sparne started out, there wasn't a fingering chart, and he would say to some of his students early on, right, go and work it out. That's what I had to do. And that's how we've all got there on bass clarinet. We've had hand-me-down fingerings from our teachers, and then we've found what really works for us. And then, you know, you'll find a high note fingering that works really beautifully soft, but then you'll need another one more loud, or you'll need another fingering for a jump, whereas another fingering will work for a step-by-step passage. So it's very much kind of feel your way through and learn as many as you can. Yeah, big heart for Harry.
I think, if you don't mind my jumping in here, I mean, part of the first discovery of when you start to become proficient, I guess that's the right word, on the bass clarinet, is the issue of when do you use third partial fingerings or when do you use fifth partial fingerings. Now, of course, on the bass clarinet, most of the manufacturers have that funny little half-hole key, you know, for playing, you know, the really high notes. But, you know, the third partial fingerings have a real resonance to them, and they sound beautiful. Like if you're, some of the movements in Pierrot where you're playing up there sound way better when you're using those fingerings as opposed to the standard fingerings that you use on soprano clarinet. And the only challenge with that is they need to be controlled, because they have a tendency to want to go back to the fundamental. But, you know, once you can get the handle on that, it is just absolutely gorgeous bass clarinet tone for playing, again, plaintively up really high. So that's one of the challenges.
And to, you know, make the effort to learn the bass clarinet fingerings as well, because it's not a clarinet, it's a different instrument, and standard clarinet fingerings ultimately just don't work. You know, you'll get away with them here and there, but they're very closed, and
Out of tune.
bass is brilliant. Yeah, they're out of tune, they're unreliable. You really have to treat the bass clarinet as a unique instrument in the altissimo.
I thank you for all of those links. I put those in the chat on Facebook live. So that's terrific.
Great.
Another topic, let's talk now about extended techniques. Okay, so as a bass clarinetist, what kind of extended techniques would you recommend players learn? All of them, right?
Yeah, multiphonics. You have to learn multiphonics because it teaches you all about voicing, and it teaches you about instruments. It teaches you about the harmonics. Oh, it just teaches you everything. I think I learned more about the bass clarinet doing my doctorate in multiphonics than, years and years of studying solo repertoire. So for me, multiphonics. You can buy my book as well.
I think all of them are great. Double tonguing comes in handy. Circular breathing, I do that all the time when I need to make long phrases. A lot of the composers write things that knowing that you'd have to circular breathe. Multiphonics, of course. Glisses, doing lots of really cool harmonic glisses on the bass clarinet. That's one of my favorite sounds. I'm working with a composer, Joel Love, right now, and he's like, what's the angriest sound you can make? And of course, that's what I go to, is finding the demon inside my bass clarinet, and it's just a great effect. I also just put in a slap tongue guide there. That's such a cool sound on bass clarinet. Everyone's like, how are you doing that? Is that a percussion thing you're doing on the side? Like, that's really one of our big tricks that we can do as bass clarinet players, is slapping.
I think that there's so many possibilities for the things that the bass clarinet can do, even more so than the B flat clarinet, just because of the acoustics of it, that we've now that composers have discovered what's possible, they're exploiting that, and you need to know how to do that stuff if you're going to really keep up with the times. And I, as an orchestral bass clarinet player, I don't do a lot of solo stuff, so I am not as proficient as the ladies here with stuff like that. But it is the 21st century, and it is going to be expected of everybody, expected by the people who write for the instrument, expected by the audiences to come to hear the instrument. And the fact that it's, bass clarinet has just sort of taken off in the last 20 years. It's not just the bum, 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 bum anymore. And there are lots of great resources to find out about that. I'm looking, I pulled out a copy of the Clarinet magazine. When you are an ICA member, I think one of the real benefits that is a pretty new one is the ability to 49 years of clarinet magazines at your fingertips. And back in 2014, they dedicated an entire issue to bass clarinet matters, everything from internet resources, player profiles, a list of all the bass clarinetists and orchestras all over the country. So there's places to read about and find out about all the things that are going on bass, because it really is a fairly recent phenomenon that everybody discovered everything you could do on bass and is now upping everybody's game.
I think that is one book that should be in every bass clarinet player's library, and that is Harry Spano's book, Spano Personal History. It's more than a biog. It is the history of solo bass clarinet, and he discusses all of the techniques as well. He lists repertoire, he does fingerings, he lists key players as well. And he really wrote that book as a way of passing information on to the next generation. And for me, it's really the book. I don't think there is another book that is out there that is as good as Harry's book for bass, apart from all the stuff.
I know that Henri Bach, he did his dissertation at Leiden University in the Netherlands on that topic. And I know that he's planning on publishing a book that takes all the research that he did and puts it into book form. Actually, he's the one who introduced me to that university.
I think we have to be very careful with his book, though. I mean, Henri Bock wrote a book on techniques as well, but there are a lot of errors in that book. For example, the multiphonic charts, they're so unreliable, and issues with transposition. And I feel that Harry really ironed out a lot of unanswered questions with his book. And it's also very, very clear, Harry's book. So for me, the Bock book isn't something that I recommend anymore, because I think there is better out there.
Harry is sorely missed.
Oh God, Harry just left the biggest hole in the bass clarinet world. But
Yes.
yeah, but what he left is amazing. I recently put up on YouTube, I popped the links in. I found an interview I did with Harry when I was doing my doctorate. There's a lot of multiphonics in there, but of course, as ever, if you tried to talk to Harry about one thing, it would very quickly go off subject and you would discuss everything. But I'll pop the links on there. And there was a lot of Harry's thoughts about teaching different techniques, how to go about learning. I'll pop the link on. It's pure Harry. I'll hunt it out.
I was so glad that we were able to honor him in the ICA before we lost him. That was a good thing.
Oh, that was a beautiful moment.
Well, are we ready to go to our final big topic? Before, of course, we can take some questions. So the last topic is the growing repertoire for bass clarinet. So fortunately, we've seen an increase in repertoire composed for auxiliary instruments, as well as seeing more pieces utilizing those instruments as a solo instrument, which is great. Can you talk about the bass clarinet repertoire as it stands today?
Sarah's the expert here.
Yeah.
We have. It's endless. There's so much. It's like, where do you start with bass repertoire out there? We have sonatas, we have concertos, we have solos. There's pieces written by composers in every country, I think, now. So yeah, where do we start?
Well, let me just add to that, and you can pick this up, which is that when I started out playing the bass clarinet in the previous millennium, there wasn't that much repertoire. I mean, you had pieces like the Boats of Ballade that I performed when I was in school, and a few other pieces like Ruth Gipp's Prelude, which is a lovely piece. But there really wasn't that much. Composers really hadn't picked up the bass clarinet as a solo instrument yet. And then, the stuff that Sarah's been doing with her commissions and things like that are just absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I think a lot of us kind of started commissioning because we couldn't access a lot of music out there. So when I started specializing, it was late 90s. You couldn't walk into a music shop at that time and buy bass music, and you couldn't go online because it was only just starting, really, and do all this research and find music. So I had maybe 2 or 3 pieces at the start, and then got in contact with Joseph Horrock, who just sent me a big pile of music and then endless CDs. And then, I went over to study in Holland, and more music opened up. But actually, ultimately, I wanted my own pieces as well, and so started commissioning and asking composers. And what I found was, as well, is like, once composers knew I was specializing, and once student composers knew I was specializing, it was like a tsunami, really. And people were like, oh, can we write a bass piece? Can we write a bass piece? And it wasn't even like, will you write a bass piece for me? It was just like, we want to write for this brilliant instrument. And so, over the course of nearly 20 years now, there's just been so much music written for me. And I know it's the same for others, like Steffi, you've had so much written for you, and my students now having music written for them. And I think with especially new music specialists, like, one of the things we want to do is add to the repertoire.
And again, I think, I'm sorry, Stephanie,
No, it's okay.
go ahead.
Go ahead. I
was just going to say, I think the problem still is, how do people access this repertoire? I mean, I wish people would share and say, hey, or we had some kind of depository where okay, this is where you can access this or contact the composers and get these pieces. So maybe continue to talk about the repertoire, but maybe address that too.
Yes, I think that's wonderful to have a place where we can find anything. You can search bass clarinet solo and find all of the solos by level, which is the next point I wanted to bring up. I find there's a lot of introductory pieces to bass clarinet, and then there's like crazy hard bass clarinet. And I think there needs to be more intermediate pieces. And if I'm not incorrect here, isn't the ICA composition contest for bass clarinet this year? And is it for a certain level, or is it open for anything, or do we know? Or does it just
don't know the level yet. I don't know. But it is.
Oh, it is open to any level.
Jessica said, yeah.
I think personally, I would love to see more intermediate level new works that are, they're not super easy and they're not gigantically hard works, more intermediate.
We started doing a little bit of that in the UK. There's an adult player who wanted to learn new pieces specifically for him, and he commissioned some that were kind of aimed at that level. There's a great piece called Mystic Star Dance by Christopher Hussey. I'll try and pop some rep in the chat. And my pianist Anthony wrote a piece, a set of pieces on mushrooms as well. Again, aimed at having a middle gap of repertoire. And maybe that's something that Stefanie and myself could work at building a list on. One for the repertoire committee for ICA, I think.
Right.
And the repertoire is out there, but again, we need lists. And the only reason I've got so much of my rep in here is literally hours and hours of internet searches.
Mm-hmm.
And I've tried as well to do commissioning projects where, again, people aren't necessarily writing for me, but I found that by doing a little project and having a theme has really helped to get repertoire that starts to fill that little gap. So I did 10 Wee Drams, which is pieces based on a Scottish island, and the remit for that, and one of the reasons we got the funding, was that it was pieces that could be played by anybody. Some of them have turned out being a little bit tricky, but I think that they're fairly accessible. Some are for contra, but the composers have given permission for them all to be played on bass. So I've done that. I'm doing another one at the moment called Feed the Hound for basset horn as well. And again, the pieces are very accessible. I did Feed the Beast for contra, and again, the pieces I asked to be accessible. So I think actually as players, we have a responsibility not to have too much of an ego for playing impossibly difficult works. And maybe that's something more that as players we can really do and work at. Maybe it's something we can discuss with somewhere like ICA. Yeah, let's have a fun commissioning project with a specific remit in mind.
Well, I think it's wonderful that, I know there's a committee that's working, with the ICA to build this great resource. So thank you to all of those who I know will be participating in that. And that'll be something really exciting to view on our new website. If you haven't seen it yet, you need to go to the ICA website, and It's just amazing. So I look forward to what all is going to be on there in the very near future. Yeah. Should we open up for some questions from people, Denise, do you think?
Sure, I think so. So who has questions for us? Got these great artists here filled with so much information.
Yeah, I think we've covered pretty much everything that I've seen. I think Daniel Dorff had mentioned something earlier when we were talking about foundational, what about a saxophonist going to bass clarinet, and any differences or similarities? So maybe we can answer that question. Or not.
Sarah, did you want to go?
I think it's the same almost as, bass going to soprano or soprano going to clarinet. It's, taking that new instrument and doing the groundwork on it. It doesn't matter what you're playing, you have to study it. When I got my Beast a few years ago, I couldn't even play an octave scale on it. It was that bad. I was like, oh my God, I've just spent like all my money in the world on this contrabass clarinet. Like, I played open G and it just like my boyfriend came and he's like, what have you spent that money on? And I spent like literally 3 months playing scales and Bach suites and long notes on it before I could play anything else at all. It sounded dreadful. And that's the approach you've got to take. I've just had to do it with basset horn. I've been playing like Mozart Requiem for years on basset horn, no problem. And then was like, well, I've got to learn it as a solo instrument now for this Feed the Hound project. So I just had to take the same tact of I've got to study it.
Here are some questions from our viewers. Can you talk about how to help students easily transition between registers on the bass clarinet? I struggle frequently with learning with barking.
You need to feed it.
I think, like Michael said earlier, a lot of times you think you may have a problem, but you don't have a problem. Your instrument has a problem because there's so many mechanisms, so many linkages, so many things that don't have to go very far out of true to completely and utterly shut you down. So first of all, try, make sure that your instrument is playing. And then you do the same thing that you would do on B flat. You just do exercises of 12ths. If you can play a C and just touch a register key and find the right change in pressure and find how that's different than your B flat, you should be able to get yourself between registers in the same way that we do on soprano clarinet. It's really not a problem, I don't think, of size of hands, since it's a closed hole instrument, which is very nice. But the keys are heavy, and for younger hands, crossing breaks and things like that really do, they provide, there are more challenges there than we have on B flat clarinet. You can pretty much leave right hands down almost without exception. You can leave as much of your right hand down, more so than on B flat clarinet, so that you can pre-place fingers going across breaks. But otherwise, you just do the same sorts of exercises where you're going back and forth across breaks or across registers. And it's a matter of learning the feel. It's not enough just to be pressing the right buttons. You have to be internally well situated to make those register changes, make things like that happen. You can often tell if you have an instrument problem. Everything seems fine, you're working one way, and then suddenly everything is profoundly not fine, and that's not you. That's an instrument, that's a pad, that's a linkage that hasn't been. And a lot of times, when you have a bass clarinet, you just do that and you twist the tiniest bit and you go from having nothing to playing completely at ease. And that can change from day to day, depending on how you slammed your case shut last time, or who walked by your horn funny. So if it's not coming out, I think the instrument is often at fault.
I'd like to add
I would like to add one thing to that, just as someone who was a middle school band director at the beginning of my career, is teaching students to properly assemble the instrument so that they're not putting undue pressure at places where they shouldn't be touching it, making sure that bridge keys are lined up, making sure, if they've got a low C bass clarinet, it's going to be a lot different things to think about than if you just have one of the baby basses, as I call them, that doesn't have that extension, and not grabbing onto the two register vents up top. It's so easy, for them to get out of whack if people are grabbing onto things and forcing them together, especially old bass clarinets that have been sitting in the back of a band room closet and haven't been taken care of. So, what advice would you give our younger people watching, or people who they may be great B flat players but haven't picked up a bass yet? How can they protect their instrument to make sure that it actually is going to play when they put it together?
Court grease. Make sure
Cork
your
grease.
corks are
Cal
greased.
Opperman used
Do
to say
not
cork
want
grease
to
is in vogue. So,
do not force anything. You don't want to bend anything because there's so many things that can go horribly wrong, and just cork grease is a simple answer.
And after you've applied plenty of cork grease, absolutely forever and always carry the bass clarinet by the bottom joint, not above, because I have certainly seen half a bass clarinet fall off because somebody was diligent about cork grease, but not diligent about gravity.
Well, and the other one too is make sure that your bridge keys in the middle are lined up. You know, it's like an absolute must. I mean, one time when I was in school, I was playing with the Eastman Wind Ensemble, and Donald Hunsberger had done this new arrangement of West Side Story for an Eastman Wind Ensemble tour in Japan. And he wrote this great bass clarinet solo in one of them, and I didn't have my keys messed up. And it was like suddenly I was in outer space, and all the other clarinet players were trying not to look at me. And he took the part out after that. He took it out of the bass clarinet, so I was punished for having made that mistake. But what's interesting, and I noticed the question there about, you know, what difference between like the old Model 33 versus, you know, the current instruments. My first professional bass clarinet was a Model 33. In fact, I still have it. It's sitting over there in the case, and it still has that beautiful gray tone to it. Recently, I switched a couple of years ago to a Selmer 67B. I have the black one, which Michael Lowenstern inspired me to get, and it equally has beautiful tone. The difference is the same difference between, say, buying a 20-year-old R13. I have my old R13 over here because my current one has degraded so much, and I'm afraid from COVID to go in and sit with a repairman. So I'm using my old horn, and the new horns, they've come up with better ways of, say, fixing the fuzziness that used to be on the R13, where you don't have to do that, and you don't have to shade anymore. It's the same thing on the bass clarinet, and in fact, on the 67B, they've got a thing that forces you to line up your joint with a little screw to hold it in place. So you absolutely have to do the right thing in that particular area. So, and the other thing is they fix things like, the low B, which I used to have to shade by playing the fork on my old Model 33 to get it more resonant. So the modern instruments are better. But I mean, you buy a Selmer and you've got that beautiful Selmer tone, whether it's the old one, versus a current one. And by the way, if anyone's interested, I have an unboxing video on YouTube where I was trying out the two different 67Bs that Selmer in, where is it? Indiana sent me to try out, that me and my pal Andy Stevens, who went to Eastman with me and plays bass clarinet in the Colorado Symphony. We did an unboxing, so you might find it interesting or at least amusing.
And I feel very outnumbered here as a player of a Buffet Tosca instrument. But my first bass clarinet was a Selmer Model 33, which I played for 20 years, from like 1985 for 20 years after that to 2005, and then a Prestige for 10, and now a Tosca. And they're all great instruments. The old Selmers certainly had something in them. When I was in school in Philadelphia, I was taking some bass clarinet lessons with Ronnie Rubin, and that was his suggestion at the time. He felt like the Selmer instruments had personality, and they cut through an orchestra in a way that the Buffets did not. I was a little sad to leave it, but at the now 15 years ago, the Buffet instruments seemed to be the thing everybody was doing, and I'm interested. I'm bummed that the convention won't be happening in person this year, because I'd like to take the opportunity to see what you guys like about these instruments.
Yeah, my first bass clarinet actually was a Buffet low E flat instrument, and the problem was that the middle, like B and C and C sharp,
Are
were
so sharp.
wildly sharp,
Right.
and that was a big problem. And the other reason why the Model 33 was so popular was because it was really the first professional production level low C instrument with the 3 spatula keys on your right thumb. In fact, that's the biggest transition problem I've been having using my new horn, is they just threw all these notes all over the place on the low end, supposedly to make it better. And it's like, why can't I just use my old system? It works perfectly. But they are better horns now. And I played buffets too. Buffet makes beautiful instruments. Some people think that the low register, the Selmer, is better, and the upper register, the buffet, is better. But I don't think anybody could really hear the difference of a player playing one versus the other. They're both gorgeous horns.
It's just so personal with instruments, isn't it? I mean, it's all right, all these discussions on Facebook, what instrument, what mouthpiece should I get? But actually, until you're in the music shop or at the conference trying stuff out, there's no way of knowing. And, I literally play on Selma because I absolutely love the Selma sound. But equally, I have colleagues on Buffet who play on Buffet because they love the Buffet sound. Bakun, they love the Bakun sound. And it's just so personal and individual to us all.
As Denise and I like to say, can't we all get along? So, yeah, there's just such a wonderful array of equipment and products out there that when we can all be back together again at conferences, it'll be fun to try things again, right?
Right. Can I bring up a topic that we haven't really talked about yet?
Yes, please.
Reeds. So I find that a lot of people who start bass clarinet for the first time, their reed strength is incredibly hard. At least for me, I play a much softer reed strength on bass clarinet than I do on soprano clarinet. And I don't know if that's the case for the other people in the room. I would love to talk about reed strength.
I play the same for all of them, but I often mix strengths a little bit. So rather than getting just a box of 3.5, I'll get a box of 3 and a box of 3.5, and kind of use what works. I never play about with my reeds because I'm just a destroyer with a reed knife. And I don't have time. I'm working pretty much full time at the uni at the moment, and practice time is valuable. I don't have time to mess around with reeds. So it's out the box, blow them in, they work or they don't. But I find for me the best thing, certainly with bass, is to have a box of 3 and a box of 3.5 and get a good collection.
Sarah Watts, destroyer of reed.
There should be a t-shirt.
I like that.
That should be on your bio.
Yeah.
The t-shirts can be sent to me, and I will display them on Facebook.
One difference is, and I used to do this. Well, first of all, I rework all of my reeds, whether they're soprano or bass clarinet, because that's what Mr. Hasty conscripted us to do by forcing us to go to reed class every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. So we were highly motivated to learn, so we wouldn't have to go. But back in the old days, and John Ye used to do this too, is we would use Van Doren tenor saxophone reeds because they're pretty much the same size. The difference is that you get a little bit more cane. You've got more cane to work with. So in terms of number, I have no idea what number I use. It really depends on what mouthpiece I'm using, and I fit it to the instrument. The other thing that we haven't really talked about are what mouthpieces we're using. So if you don't mind, I'll jump into that too.
Yeah, that's a question in the chat, so perfect.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I mean, for years I used a Charlie Bay bass clarinet mouthpiece, which I loved, and it's still a good mouthpiece. And then a few years ago, Mike Lowenstern was bugging me to get a Van Doren, and it was an interesting journey, by the way, because Van Doren sent me like 9 mouthpieces, and I went through them with Andy Stevens when I was living in Denver. Andy and I went through these mouthpieces. I didn't like any of them. And then what ended up happening was David Gould called me up and wanted to horse trade a set of my bass clarinet books for a Van Doren mouthpiece. And I said, well, sure, as long as you pick out a good B50 for me. And he did, and it's a terrific mouthpiece. And of course, it raises questions about why is it that that one was so much different than the other ones that they sent me? So I don't know if it's a matter of quality control or personal preference, or the fact that a lot of times mouthpieces are going to vary, even the exact same model from one to the next. So and the bottom line, and I see Sarah nodding, is that you just have to try them out and see what works for me. I love this new, B50 I have is absolutely terrific.
Yeah, that's why I came off crystal. I played on crystal for years. I played on crystal on B flat as a kid. I nicked my mum's, and then went on to bass after that. But I mean, crystal, it's a wild variation from mouthpiece to mouthpiece. And I dropped my crystal in a concert. It's the one time I said very bad words very loudly on stage. And I found another one that I liked, but it was agony trying to choose a crystal. And again, I'd been put under quite a bit of pressure by my bass teacher to play crystal, and as were his students as well. And a lot of people said to me, "Oh, you can't get much color on a crystal," and I think you can get color on a crystal. But now I've come back to Van Doren and the B50. I just do think that actually you get much more color on a black mouthpiece than on a crystal. And I can't play my crystals now. I would never go back to a crystal again. But it's so personal. I love the B50. I've got students on the BDs on bass. I've got students who love the Grabners on bass. The new Selma concept and focus, I've got students on those, and Phobes, mouthpieces. So there's so much. But I love my B50.
For the longest time, through my interactions with Dennis Smiley out in Aspen, I played on mouthpieces by Bill Street.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, up in Maine. He was a clarinet and saxophone teacher and a preacher. I had one I liked very much, and I was putting my horn together, walking on stage to play Shlomo with Yo-Yo Ma, and I dropped it. And I thought, oh my God, I survived. And then I looked, and the patch was the only thing holding the beak on to the rest of it. So we backstage, we grabbed some super glue and lodged it in there, and it held up for the concert. But I bought another mouthpiece by Bill Street, which I also liked. But in the meantime, I wanted to try some other things, and I've been playing on a very nice mouthpiece by Brad Bain for the last 5 years that I really, really like. It's one of his pricey mouthpieces. It's a little more open than I had been playing before. And I made the shift probably 5 or 6 years ago to synthetic reeds. I play them on B flat now too, but long before I played Leger reeds on B flat, I played them on bass. And I play Leger signature 2 3/4 reeds on bass, where in Cain on B flat, I might play 3.5 pluses in D'Addario, 3.75, something like that. So a fairly different feel for me. But I really think as you get into the larger reeds, larger tolerances, it's more about integrity than material. I find that for me anyway, bass reeds have a terrible tendency to warp. And especially if you're playing orchestrally, you've been playing third clarinet for 20 minutes and you pick up your bass and you go to play and you wonder, how come I'm only blowing air and no sound is coming out? And then you realize that there's so much warp in the reed.
A little wave.
Right. And not like tip warp, but like body warp. So I find that the consistency, I could go through a bunch of boxes of Cain reeds and probably at the end of the day find one that I really loved, but I wouldn't trust it 3 weeks from now. So I'm an enthusiast of synthetic reeds, and bass was where I started with them.
You should try the contra reeds for warp.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, like with contra as well, it's got very, very lazy, I think, with the reed makers. So Van Doren only do, whole strengths. You can't get a half strength, and we're desperate for half strengths. So I think, yeah.
Buy a box of those, and you'll never want for tongue depressors, right?
Who
We're
needs
so
that?
fortunate to have so much great equipment. There's something for everybody out there, to help you get that sound that you want to get. Yeah. What would you recommend for students starting out on bass clarinet, or band directors who might be watching? What would you encourage them to get that's a reasonably priced mouthpiece that would be a good general something for students to start with?
I think a Van Doren.
Van Doren or the Selmer concept
Yeah,
or Focus.
Okay.
Yeah, they're really good.
Great.
Anyone is going to be better than the pawn shop random one that was made in 1920 that comes along with the instrument.
Well,
Doorstop.
is there anything else that maybe we haven't covered that in our last few minutes that our panelists would like to offer? Any words of wisdom?
Play bass.
Play
Yeah.
bass.
If you're within the sound of our voice, play the bass clarinet.
And fall in love with it.
Don't be afraid to use air.
Engage the cage, right? Yes.
Yeah, and find the area that you like to play. Don't let anybody tell you you can't do it. Because when I decided I was going to specialize in bass and go and do my masters on it, my teachers in London told me I was throwing my career away. But I stuck to my guns. Some of us love orchestral playing, and it's such a skill. And people like me, you wouldn't put me in an orchestra. You would sack me by the end of the day. But I appreciate it's a skill. But if you want to go and specialize and do new music, go and specialize and do new music. Don't let anybody tell you can't be yourself.
Well, the other thing I want to point out is that for people who've only played the bass clarinet in band, the writing in band is completely different than the writing for the bass clarinet in the orchestra. And there's no comparison. What you play in orchestra is so much better the way they write for it than they do in concert band pieces.
And unless you're in a really top-notch, large, big district school with tons of kids, you're going to be playing band literature that's of a medium difficulty, and the bass clarinet parts just aren't that interesting, and they're not that challenging, and you're never pressed to improve.
True. You guys, is there anybody have anything else in our audience or our artists here? It's been such a great discussion. I've learned a lot, and I love playing bass. I have some students who love it as well. And you are all inspirations to me on bass clarinet. So just thank you for that, and for being that for all of us out there. Just please come back and share with us again. Diane and I love to get to talk with you all like this, and it's, I think, a great time. That's one of the great things to come out of the sadness of COVID, is that we've learned to be able to get together no matter what and still be able to share with clarinet players everywhere. So thank you for helping us make that work.
Looking forward to tuning into some more of the events this weekend.
Good. We hope you can enjoy some of that. And again, we appreciate all of you so very much and what you do for the clarinet and bass clarinet world. Thank you so much.
Yes, very much so.
Thanks for putting this together, you guys, and for inviting us.
Enjoy.
Before
Yeah.
Harry died, his one legacy he wanted was for the bass clarinet to continue to thrive and flourish. So let's keep playing bass for Harry.
Yes, that's a great thing to do. And then John and Reno, save a chair for me. We'll be back in the professor's choir.
You're to my left.
Yes. Oh, well, and guys, please come back and join us, because just a little bit later at 1 o'clock Central Time, we've got our next session, which is going to be just So You Want to Write for Clarinet. And we've got some wonderful composers with us, and we hope that you'll enjoy us for that and continue the conversation both here and on Facebook Live, right? Diane, anything else you want to add?
I don't think so,
Yeah.
but thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day. We hope we see some of you later. And again, thank you all, our panelists, for your wonderful expertise.
Yes, and if you missed any of this, it will be posted both on our Amicitia Duo Facebook page and on our YouTube channel.
Yes. So you can watch it as many times as you want. Woo. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.